Even with lockdown mode, even with a VPN, you've protected the data at the application layer. The whole cellular side is still left wide open.
Welcome to what I think is one of the most groundbreaking interviews we've ever done on Techlore Talks, because we are going to pretty much expand on something that has very little to no information on the internet, especially in a centralized place, which is cellular privacy. What does it look like? Why is it not private? What can all of you do about it? I'm really excited to have Cape on to discuss this, and they're going to be covering how everything works behind the scenes, what your typical provider can see and can't see about your information, the security vulnerabilities in each step of the process, what this looks like for protesters, what this looks like between iOS and Android, the features that you can customize. It's a really big deep dive, and hopefully we take these technical concepts and make them accessible to all of you. And of course, he will touch on what Cape does a little bit differently and how they try to add privacy into the mix. So without further ado, let's get into the interview. I just wanted to start by asking, what does a typical cellular carrier actually see about their customers?
Yeah, there's a lot that they see, ranging from both what they collect on the business side and what's needed on the technical side. And a lot of times those are kind of intermixed with each other. So a lot of times you sign up for, postpaid service, they'll collect your name, your address, your social security number, sometimes if they need to run a credit check. Those types of things are pretty standard for like the sign up process. And then there's all the things that you sort of need to run the telco itself, to run your service. And there's going to be, different identifiers that go in there, like most notably starting at the device, like they can see your IMEI when you register. That's your equipment identifier that identifies your specific phone. They'll be able to see, the service and information about your subscriber that you have, most correlated with what's called an IMSI or subscriber identifier. Those, tend to follow your SIM card, and so they can kind of tell where you are at different points in time and what services you've subscribed to. And then there's, how do I actually get, communication on a cellular network is all, how do I get radio waves from a tower to you? And so they clearly need to know some degree of where you are so they can send it out over the right tower. Or if you're, in another country and you're roaming, what other operator do I need to send information to correspond with how I actually hand this off to someone else to send that information to you. So there's kind of good bit ranging from things you actually need for your service to work all the way to like, how do I, productize and how do I make money off of this system?
Yeah, and then what are the general concerns that you've seen as a result of this tracking? I mean, one could just say that this is, just part of running the service. So what's actually the issue with all this kind of data?
Yeah, and a lot of it comes from, there was sort of like this implicit trust that occurs with, a lot of these different networks. And, I think a lot of it was designed with best intentions in mind. But when you start to, kind of put more of an adversarial kind of spin on it or a lens, you start to think, hey, if I know where, someone is at all times, is that information that could be like tracked, collected, and sold to someone else? If my system is exploited, can someone pull that information without me knowing? All the way down to things like, hey, if I can reroute someone's traffic from point A to point B, and they're not actually at point B, could I intercept it, get their two-factor authentication code? Could I pretend to be them? Could I spoof something? And so these networks had this trust in mind, but they can be abused, and sometimes by design and sometimes by unintended consequences of the time period we're in now, where information and data is more valuable than ever.
Yeah, and have there been stories and incidents that you guys can cite where this data has very clearly been abused, in your view?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different stories. Towards I think there's a classic one where, I forget the name of the story. It's like, I paid a bounty hunter like $100 or $500 to locate me, and they did it within like X number of minutes. And so this data is readily available, and there's lots of different flaws in the system, ranging from social engineering. Maybe it's support, customer support person who's tricked, or maybe someone is compromised. And especially now when you start to think about people for who they are or what they're doing, this information can be very valuable and very dangerous and put into the wrong hands. Think like, a journalist trying to tell a story who might be targeted, or a victim of domestic abuse who may be trying to escape. And there's very tangible consequences to what this looks like. And when so readily available, and another thing I'll note is that, even if you kind of do your best effort, a lot of times this information passes through many systems you may or may not have control over. And so whether it goes into another billing system or whether it goes through a roaming network, it's the lineage of this data can be hard to track and therefore can leak out in all kinds of ways.
Did you watch the Linus Tech Tips video where I think they did a SIM swap attack to hack into his channel using that cell
Yes, I
tower
remember,
issue?
watching that happen live. Yeah.
Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I forget. It was a while ago when I watched. I think right at the beginning of the company. See, a lot of the like a SIM swap attack carried out in a number of ways. A lot of times handled through customer service or bribes or any of those types. I forget exactly what they did in the video. But
I think it was an SS7 exploit.
SS7 attack. Yeah,
I think it was SS7.
Yeah, and SS7, is it's always been like a sort of a lingering problem. And less so now with kind of sunsetting of 3G networks, but no matter how much you sunset a network, it still exists in the global scale. I haven't had to deal with it with as much staying in the 4G and 5G world, but yeah, you can quite easily trick phones and tech networks into thinking, hey, this device is actually somewhere else.
This is a bit of a broad question, but can you walk me through what happens if I make a call to somebody else? Just on a regular cell network, not via, a messenger or signal or anything like this. Like, what does it look like behind the scenes when I make a call?
Yeah. So, typically it starts with, your phone connecting to the network. Let's say you power your phone on. Your phone will start to, look for different networks to connect to. That's informed by your SIM card. Your SIM card has programmed in different identifiers and different preference lists for different networks to connect to, whether to treat them as roaming or not roaming. And a lot of times your phone will kind of prolifically try to connect to whatever network seems the strongest, or based on what its preferences are. And usually part of that, depending on whether you're in the 4G or 5G world, is you tell the network, here I am, this is my identifier, can I connect to your network? The network, depending on whether you're kind of a native subscriber of that network, or if you're roaming on that network, will then kind of query whoever's the quote unquote owner of the subscriber, go back and pull an authentication challenge. The device and the network in 4G and above will mutually authenticate each other. So, hey, like, yes, I am the network you claim to be trying to connect to, and yes, you are the user that is trying to connect. And then once that's established, they'll frequently establish what's called security context, exchange based on key material, which is kind of pre-distributed in your SIM card and on the backend system that already exists to create a secure tunnel. Secure being on certain different parts of the network of different types of security. This part is on the what's called the control plane, sort of how you do authentication and mobility management, that aspect. And then typically what will happen is also an exchange of other identifiers, like your IMEI will then get sent to the network you're connecting to. They'll frequently use that to check for whether your device is stolen or there's some sort of restriction on your device. You and the network will exchange what capabilities you have and kind of negotiate as to what services I should have. And then if you're working on a network that's again 4G and 5G, like a packet switched kind of network, so you're no longer dealing with the circuit switched part of 3G. You'll also, and you're using something like called voice over LTE or voice over new radio for the 5G standalone equivalent, you will also register to effectively like a SIP server, sending over your identifiers and authenticating on the SIP side before you subsequently make a phone call, where you will kind of change your path depending on whether it's a local, you're calling someone else on your network, or if your network needs to go find the other person wherever they are in the world and kind of hand it off to someone else. So there's kind of multiple layers of kind of registering, authenticating, sending different types of identifiers and information, all before you even get to making a phone call. And then once you make the phone call, you're kind of sending your intent to make a phone call to your own network. Your network finds out who this person is, whether they belong to you, your home network, or they belong somewhere else. And then we'll route your kind of negotiate on the call side and then start sending media traffic.
And which part of that kind of process, or multiple parts of that process, do you guys see as problematic, maybe from a privacy and or security standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is of concern. Ranging from, kind of implicit channels where information is leaked, or, things that are kind of by design that can be used to track. So example, you connect to your network, and just during the normal attach process, you're sharing your IMSI and your IMEI. IMSI is tied to your subscriber identifier that's tied to like your SIM card and your subscription, your IMEI, your equipment. So those are shared with whatever network you're attaching to. Those are typically mostly static for most people, unless you're switching SIM cards and switching devices on a regular cadence. And so that can be used to track, you as an individual subscriber or the kind of owner in possession of device, which can be really big for tracking a very specific person all over the world, down to, like what your phone number, because typically you want to give your phone number out to your friends, to your family, so they have, a unique address on how to contact you that stays the same. But that's also seen in both the control plane traffic that you see during your authentication process as part of your subscriber data profile, as well as when you're registering to make a phone call. And so that can be, subsequently correlated to other identifiers. Say you transfer your service from one SIM to another, and or one carrier to another carrier, and you bring your phone number with you. That phone number is still following you in all the traffic that can be seen, and they can then correlate, okay, you have this device, now you have the other device. So all those pieces, are these breadcrumbs that you can follow without too much difficulty if you're in the telco space.
Yeah, I think people just assume, if I have an Android phone right now and I have Verizon as my carrier, and I'm going to switch over to both AT&T and get an iPhone. It feels like a fresh start, but if you port your phone number over, what you're implying is that there's still a very direct link there between the two devices.
Exactly. It's like, your phone number is your name on the network. It's, you change your clothes, but, people can still, see your face and identify you in that way. It's a very hard thing to break, to break your identity and all the services and usefulness you get by having a static phone number with, all the downsides that also comes with it.
Got it. Okay, now, I want to get a little bit more into the tracking methods specifically, and because you guys cite a lot of stuff on your blog, and I feel like even some of these attacks go well beyond my technical understanding, and so I like to ask someone who's definitely a bit more of an expert on this. I have a very basic understanding of cell tower triangulation and geofencing. My overall concept of this is my phone wants to always connect to the fastest cell towers, that's the most reliable, and so it's constantly pinging. But that constant pinging allows someone with the full access to that network of the cell towers to see like, oh, this person is moving throughout here because it's stronger over here right now, and there's this triangulation aspect. Is that an overall good summary of how that works, or am I making this a little bit too simplified? And how can that process be abused?
Yeah, I mean, you can follow the rabbit hole all the way down. It can get very, very complicated down to like the physics behind it. But, at a rough level, that's about right. I mean, not only can you track on the application layer, like, if I'm going from tower A to tower B, my session state is handed off from tower A to tower B. So now I know, like, at a very rough level, like, hey, I'm within the purview of this tower, now I'm within the purview of that tower. But the way that you actually establish your connections to the tower, involves, very like precise calculation and timing. And that timing with how long it takes a signal to get from A to B can be used. And if you look at like the tower information to kind of get a much more accurate picture of where you are, because the coordination with the tower is very important to make sure everyone's on the same page, to make sure all the users within that are all served by the same cell are getting the right signals to each other, and that I can connect. So it goes down from both the high level on moving from tower A to B, but also, again, like you said, relative signal strength, the time it takes, and the coordination effort between the two. You can kind of measure delays and do a little bit of math and get a fairly accurate understanding of where people are.
And how accurate is this? Is this like within a mile, or is it like within 10 feet?
I mean, I think you can, with the right access to information, you can get it down to within meters, a handful of meters is what I've been told. That one I don't know for sure, but it's kind of scary to think. And especially I'll note as we're kind of spinning up more and more radios, we're not in the world, especially you live in a city where you have radios that are covering miles. You might have radios that are covering very, very specific areas. You could have a radio that's covering just the entrance of a stadium. You could have a small cell radio that's covering, a New York City block. And if you think about how those, can differ, I mean, you can also have a radio tower like I have outside my window here that covers, the span of a mile. You can have one that covers, like I have in my office here in my lab, just 20 feet in all direction. And you can really start to narrow it down even by what tower you're connected to based on the signal strength.
Got it. And I also want to maybe clear this up, because I think a lot of people think if they turn off the location services on their phone, that where they go can't be tracked. But this is all entirely independent of that, correct?
Correct. This is all at the kind of cellular connectivity level. A lot of the location services, use your GPS. You can use your Wi-Fi access points that you're connected to figure this out. This is all just information that's needed by the cell towers to, connect you to it. And some of those can be manipulated. Some of those can not be manipulated due to physics, but all of this is happening just to maintain your cellular connection.
Got it. And then I'll talk about, or I'll not talk about, but I'll ask you about threats later on and how to address those. But I still want to clear through a bit more of the tracking methods here. So another thing that I saw online a lot was call data records. And so what are kind of the concerns around how a typical carrier might handle call records? And I guess we can throw in SMS records as well if that's similar.
Yeah. And so, I mean, typically call data records, or CDRs as their acronym, because everyone loves acronyms. The intent behind them is around billing and accountability. The problem is that these are stored for, potentially very long periods of time, potentially years. And, there's some good intent around them. Originally it's like, hey, I'm using the network. I need to piece together who did what so I can bill them for the right information, or I was on a roaming network, and so they send me the CDRs so I can, bill my user accordingly. Another part of it is these are kind of my proof of this user did use the network this amount. So like as an MVNO or as a roaming agreement, if they send you a bill and say, hey, this person used 10 gigabytes, my CDRs are my proof of whether they did or didn't. And if they did not and we disagree, we can mediate. And this is my proof of like, look, they only used this amount. This is how I can account for it. So there's, some legitimate use, for these, but they can be fairly invasive because the content of them can vary from carrier to carrier. So things like your subscriber ID, your IMSI, things like your IMEI can make it in there. Maybe they don't actually need your IMEI because they know it's tied to your subscriber. So there can be data leaks that occur here. Not to mention, when you mentioned SMS, all the SMS that you send through traditional SMS protocols, not counting any over-the-top app, those are all visible to your network provider. And those can make their way into data sets that you don't want to know. I don't know if you ever logged into your cellular provider service portal. Sometimes you can actually see the record and content of every single message you've sent. I remember as a kid, when I found out my parents could see that, I was like, oh, maybe I should think twice about what I'm sending to my best friend across the room during school hours. But I think the real thing comes from, one, a lack of people knowing what's in these, because there can be legitimate use cases. And two, obviously you have to kind of proactively defend yourself if you care about what's stored there. But the other side of this is the longevity of these records. Some places may store these for 5+ years. And if you think like, hey, someone can go kind of back in the time machine and see what I was doing at a different period of time, that's kind of a scary thought that they can kind of reconstruct what you were doing. A lot of times these will contain, potential information about where you were at the time, like the cell tower you're connected to. And so it's kind of scary when you think that there's a long period of time in which these can be connected to that's just sitting there that someone could take or steal or could be subpoenaed or, any of those options.
Yeah, and I think what's fascinating here is it's a bit of a myth, actually. I think I've heard this at least 5 times in my life from people where they go, oh, let's not email this, let's text this. So there's this odd myth out there that SMS is more secure than email. And it's not like email is secure either. These are both, to their core, they seem like inherently insecure protocols. But I would argue in some ways email is actually a little bit better for most people. I don't know if you guys have a view on which one is worse than the other.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you like what can be seen and how easy it can be. It all depends on the choices that you're making at the time, the threat model of when you're acting. A well set up email server can be secure or it can be insecure. I can definitely tell you that a telco can see every SMS that you're sending. I don't know, like I know I can readily access that information. We have to actively work to design systems where we can't do that, or it's very, very, very hard to do that, and encourage people to not use that. Pick and choose where you want to put your fate if you're using either of them.
So the next threat I have here is SIM swaps and IMSI catchers. So this is a very common one, especially in light of protests, which I know are quite common right now in the US. So what can people what would you overall uh, explain to someone who's new to the idea of SIM swaps and IMSI catchers, and also where the cell company kind of has a role in this?
When it comes to, I think in a cellular company's role, like the SIM swaps, I think they'll play a much larger role in, because typically, especially in 4G and 5G, that comes to typically issuing a new SIM, to someone else. A lot of times through social engineering, hey, I contact customer support and I say, hey, hit me up at this my WhatsApp number, my Signal number, and I'll give you $50 for something. And they can reactivate a SIM, give you a QR code to download and go that way. Or porting someone's number from A to B if there's not protection. So the carrier plays an active part based on their security principles that they follow. How readily am I willing to transfer someone's number or give someone a new SIM or deactivate their old SIM? A lot of that is control, of the cellular provider for the user. Now, IMSI catchers are kind of a different story because, despite what a carrier might do, it's very hard to stop someone malicious who's, on the ground with a radio from setting up their own IMSI catcher. And a lot of that has nothing to do with the operator. It has to do with the protocols that exist within cellular space. And that, like, for example, in 4G with an IMSI catcher, by definition, the protocol has a flaw where you can request your IMSI, which is typically static for people unless they're changing it, which is not a common feature, to just trick someone's phone into attaching. Pretty early on in my time at working in telecom space, I bought a cheap software-defined radio, and I did an IMSI catcher on myself, and I was able to get that done. And you can watch YouTube videos on how you get that done in like an hour or a couple hours. And a lot of that is between the equipment, the phone, and the device itself. And I mean, there are lots of ways you can go about like detecting if these things are happening. A lot of times it can be like, hey, can the device, you lose service or a blip in service you didn't expect. Might be you attempted to connect to a rogue base station IMSI catcher, because a lot of times these are going to be service disrupting. Your phone's going to be scanning, it's going to attempt to attach to something, and it's going to keep going. And I think looking for ways to mitigate those types of things, either by changing those identifiers or ideally in like the technology and the standards themselves, so like moving to something like 5G standalone, where the IMSI is significantly less readily accessible. It's encrypted and exchanged securely. Helps to patch some of these things. And being cognizant of the situation you're in, and maybe it's like, hey, I'm at a protest and I think I might be tracked here. Thinking through, do you need a solution that can change these identifiers? Do I want to turn my phone off? Do I want to take my SIM card out? Do I want to have a different SIM card that I use completely? Ranges from being not very sophisticated to ultra sophisticated.
Yeah, and I guess on that note, I'd love to start talking about some of the solutions. I want to start by just going through solutions that anyone can pursue, regardless of what phone or cell carrier they use. And then, of course, I want to get into how you guys change that and what you deal with on a root level, because I know you guys are quite different from an MVNO, and we'll touch on that in a second. To start with, maybe something like, I'm going through the list here: cell tower triangulation and geofencing. What are kind of the go-to solutions for a regular person to help navigate that? Maybe from like easiest and like less effective to the most effective.
Yeah. I mean, there's, very not sophisticated things like, turning your phone off, putting it in a Faraday bag, any of those options that prevents, cellular radiation, or attempting to connect to networks. As as everything is sort of working on normal function, your phone's going to be constantly trying to stay connected. That's what its job is. And so kind of eliminating the ability for it to, present any signal to the world is like the most kind of naive way to stop yourself from being tracked, but comes at a downside of you don't have connectivity. So it can be a little bit tough if you need to stay portable, use your GPS and maps, whatever, as you're moving from A to B. Then you can get, ultra sophisticated. Some of these things that are used to track, things like, geofences and triangulation and things like that. They can be a tougher nut to crack, simply because it has a lot to do with timing and it has a lot to do with your modems. And those are not, necessarily easy and approachable things to do. There are features that can be developed that can, tweak these items, but for the most part, I think they're not going to be very approachable except by, different OEMs, things like that. I'm not saying someone in the right hacker space couldn't get it to work, but I think a lot of those basics with how they function are going to be not overly approachable. But the other side of that is, carrier changing could also be, sort of an effective thing, which is, spreading out the data to different groups of people. And so, if I'm, on carrier A and then switch to carrier B, you're splitting your story between A and B. And now, if you're assuming compromise, you have to compromise both A and B, which might be hard. Or if this data is being brokered or sold, maybe it gets put into different buckets. And so those are probably the most tangible ways for kind of those lower level type attacks to try to prevent against them, minus significant investment on the equipment side and coordination with the network.
Got it. And then what about something like call data records and SMS messages?
Typically the easiest thing to do, and I'll note, like, there are multiple types of CDRs. So CDRs are collected, hit on every single major service, like voice, messaging, and data. All three of them create CDRs of different value. So when you use normal telephony channels, so I use voice over LTE, I'm using my native carrier's call. Avoiding doing that is going to be a way to prevent CDRs from being generated by your voice call. Same thing for SMS. So using an over-the-top app like a Signal, like a WhatsApp, anything that takes it out of the normal telephony channels and moves it into the data channel is going to be pretty effective at stopping CDRs from being generated for those activities. And instead, you'll move it from a highly specific CDR, like, I'm number A and I called number B at this time, and instead move it to a more broader CDR, which is I had a data session at this time. And the contents of that data session don't make it into a CDR because, people are sending gigabytes of data over. It's mostly meant for like a billing practice, not really showing what you did, just that you used the network. And so kind of shifting your practice to using those over-the-top apps can be very effective. But I will note it comes at, a downside in the sense of, there are certain things the networks are that prioritize. So for example, when you make a voice over LTE call or VoLTE call, normal call on 4G, you're getting specific types of connections that are guaranteeing bandwidth, that are guaranteeing latency, that are set up specifically to optimize your voice call that you might not get, from a data channel session or something like Signal. I think we've gotten to the point where cellular networks are powerful enough to be able to support all of those, but in a pinch and low connectivity, maybe those apps don't work. You still might want to consider, depending on your situation, if it's an emergency or not, using those channels. And so you don't get to take advantage of those designs of the network, but those are becoming less and less relevant as time goes on.
Got it. And then a question I've always had actually is Wi-Fi calling. What are the implications of opting into something like Wi-Fi calling instead of just not touching it at all?
Wi-Fi calling can shift the sort of where the information flows. And so effectively what happens, you go and click on Wi-Fi calling, and now it says your carrier and Wi-Fi, is you're basically setting up like an IPsec connection, so a secure VPN tunnel to an endpoint hosted by your cellular service, and you're putting your registration over that. And so your data goes over, a non-secured, I think a kind of not trusted channel, which is like open Wi-Fi over an IPsec tunnel to the back end. From there, everything else is the normal flow. You may, except, more of your carrier sees more information or all the information, while intermediaries don't. So if I'm roaming and I have voice over Wi-Fi, I'm still connecting back to my home network, and I'm skipping the visited network that I'm roaming on along the way. But I will note that there are certain functionality that does glean information about, like, do you have Wi-Fi calling on or established? Think about the cases of handovers. I'm in the middle of a Wi-Fi call in my hotel room, and I walk out of my hotel room, and my call continues to work, even though I'm outside of Wi-Fi range. Those are still coordinated with the cellular network. You have to tell the network that you're leaving Wi-Fi so they can transfer the call over, and now it's following a different channel. So, Wi-Fi calling, can help change the adversarial model and who can intercept, but there are ways, especially in these transition cases, where you can still provide certain information and still find yourself in a situation where that information can be collected because you, as a person, are moving as you're making that call and going in and out of Wi-Fi. And those networks need coordination to move your data session over and to make sure they land on the same gateways that they were on before, so you don't have your call dropped. So it's a nice way to provide, coverage. It's a nice way to provide higher bandwidth, but there are still kind of side channels of how that information makes its way to the different carriers if you aren't thinking about it.
Got it. And then what about like an SS7 signaling attack? What are some of the things that people can do to help protect themselves from that?
Yeah, a great thing is don't choose a network that has 3G. A lot of carriers have, deprecated their 3G networks. They don't have them around. So sticking to something that's, 4G or 5G only.
How do you do that? Like, is that a setting for people?
Yeah, and so a lot of it has to do with the network operator themselves. So you can do some background research. I think most major US carriers have sunset their 3G networks and 2G network platforms at this point, but not all of them, or depending on certain use cases, they can still see that. And a lot of the SS7 pieces are all occurring on the back end. So whatever you set your phone to do doesn't play the finalized role. So choosing a carrier that doesn't have those components to their network, which again is becoming rarer and rarer, is a great way to prevent it. And also being cognizant of, like, hey, if I go to a country that doesn't have, that still has 3G, and what network operator I'm on, knowing there are still some vulnerabilities that can exist there. But picking a network that's on 4G and 5G is probably the most approachable way. Ones that have published articles about them sunsetting or not having it anymore is probably the most attainable way to do that. And then just being cognizant when you do travel, that you could be changing your risk portfolio a little bit, especially if you're getting a SIM from a native carrier over there.
Got it. And then something I've been curious about, because there is a little bit of granularity that at least iOS gives you, and I believe Android devices as well, that at least iOS, like everything is bizarre in the way that they like tell you settings, like nothing's clear. It's like, we'll automatically decide based on unknown contexts, but you can do like automatic 4G, 5G switching, or you can do forced 5G switching. But I know the forced 5G can use a lot more battery life on iOS devices. But is there a meaningful privacy or security difference if a user is trying to maximize? So I know lockdown mode and now Android devices just straight up disable 2G now automatically to help, I think, the IMSI situation we already talked about. I think that's the main thing.
Yeah, and
I'll let
your
you explain.
IMEI in some cases, depending on which protocol you're in.
Got it. So yeah, is there a difference between, like, if someone's trying to maximize, should they only opt for 5G?
A lot of it kind of boils down to exploitation of the device itself, which can be done, with radios. And so just like how in 4G, I can force someone to send me their IMSI, and that's just in the protocol. Like, hey, if I connect to this thing, I can say, oh, send me your IMSI in the clear, and it will just do it. It's kind of a bootstrapping problem. The first time you connect, you have to send it in the clear so they know who you are, and then you switch to a more ephemeral identifier. But it's baked into the protocol so you can force it. In 3G and in 2G, the vulnerabilities in those protocols still exist because those protocols weren't updated and fixed to do that. Instead, they upgraded to the next technology. So disabling those on your devices will prevent your phone from responding with 2G or 3G protocols, which are known to be vulnerable. Where you can grab, like in 2G, IMSIs and IMEIs, and in 4G, you can definitely still grab your IMSI. Having your phone kind of locked down to not kind of accept those protocols will prevent your phone from responding in those cases. And I'll also note, like, your phone tells the network what it's capable of doing. And so it's another kind of interesting point is that like that information, not only about like, what your IMEI is, but the device capabilities, like, hey, I support 4G, I support 5G, I support these bands. All of that information does and can make its way back to the network. And so, as you change those settings, the network actually sees that you're not advertising those capabilities as well. And so you can kind of think of that as another side channel of like, oh, there's, these devices that can be exploited in this way that are out in the wild in this area. If you really want to go down the rabbit hole, it's all about, the device that can be exploited. Who knows about it? How can they cast their net? You can go forever on, complexity and whether you think it's, what the adversary model is, which I think makes it very interesting.
What you just described sounds a lot like a fingerprinting attack, like via web browsers, where if you're the only user using a certain VPN with a DNS provider, it actually makes you stand out, even though you are getting some privacy and security protections along the way. Is that like a pretty similar concept there where you're advertising that you're a different phone?
Exactly. And so, if you want to talk about like, information that phones leak, it's all over the place, ranging from like user agent information. So like, hey, I'm an Android or I'm an iOS device, or, here's Chrome, here's, a soft phone application, all of those types of things that use certain channels can be leaked. And that's why it's important, it's like, it's death by a thousand cuts. And when you want to, target something, there's a lot of information the network can have about it beyond just your normal identifiers. And if you're changing those identifiers, keeping them all in line is, an important thing to do. Otherwise, maybe you're breaking your facade that you want to put up for the world. And so if you want to correlate all of those, or, can more easily identify, someone based off of where they are, what they're doing, and the capabilities advertised, user agent, you can get, you can follow that and pull that thread all the way.
Got it. And is the user agent specific enough? Because I know we can say iOS or Android. I'm sure we don't even need to talk about operating systems. It can just see this is an iPhone 17, this is a Pixel 6, et cetera. But what about like specific custom ROMs? I know a lot of people who use privacy respecting custom ROMs might not know if their carrier is aware that they're using them. So is that some insight that a carrier would have?
It depends. A lot of it is like, these strings get to be chosen by the libraries and the ROMs that you're using. So as long as someone's conscious about what they're selecting, or if it's a privacy conscious designer of the ROM, they might know this and they might know the appropriate strings to set, or if they forked it from a particular little library or community, it may follow the initial thread from where it came from. So it can kind of depend based on the implementation.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of our audience would be curious about graphene. I don't know if they actively address that issue.
Yeah, and it can also get really complicated too, in that depending on what libraries you're using, for what, like particularly for like for voice calls and messaging that use like IMS, or which is like this multimedia subsystem. Are they writing their own library? Do they have another library? Are you inheriting debt from something else? Is it like querying the OS and pulling something? So it can all depend on the implementation of how these things get set up. But those are all like testable things that you can like look at, on the device side and on the network side, which is, what we spend a lot of time doing, which is, what can the network see? What can the device see? What is it sending? And then what can we do that's better than that?
I guess, okay, so if I'm a cell carrier and I get a new Pixel because I want to flash graphene on it, and a lot of times they still require you to like connect to Wi-Fi before you can unlock the bootloader and this stuff. But let's say I set it up on my cell carrier instead for whatever reason. The cell carrier will see, the IMSI, it'll get all the basic information that the phone sends off by default. And it'll probably see, oh, this person's running a Pixel 10, whatever, running Android. But then let's say I flash graphene on it and then I just resume. Will a carrier notice a difference between those two things? Or are you guys not aware of that?
Specifically for graphene on the Pixel, I don't know offhand, but I can imagine that it might advertise itself differently. And so they might be able to tell something changed, like, maybe user agent string changes, maybe the capabilities broadcast change, which could be, I've changed ROM and I've disabled 3G. It could be someone went in and changed the setting. So they may be able to infer something itself has changed. And kind of depending on the implementation, they might be able to, tie it to one versus the other. It's all gonna vary, based off a phone. But one thing that will remain, static is like your IMEI. So they'll still be able to tell like, hey, I'm on, this specific model of, Pixel 7. And so that's primarily what they'll probably, gauge on to kind of determine who's using our network, because it's kind of the easiest, most tractable one in many cases.
So what you're saying is that this isn't it's not like my phone just sends to a cell tower, hey, I'm running iOS, 26.2. What you're saying is more so the user agent is just various pieces of metadata that someone can use to maybe infer what someone is running on their devices. And so theoretically, if there was like Lineage OS maybe implemented something in a very unique way, it could unintentionally let cell towers know. This is all very hypothetical, but I'm assuming it's more of this like inferring from data points rather than it being just like a broadcast directly to a cell carrier. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. And to draw a distinction too, like a lot of these things are exchanged after you've authenticated to the network. So like people aren't like, sitting there pulling this information, but the network operator who kind of owns your authentication and owns your connection process can see this type of information as it kind of leaks through inside channels and through normal functionality. And, sometimes, and I don't know if many operators do this, I think back to the times where people used user agents in web browsers to optimize, for, Internet Explorer versus, Chrome versus something else. And so there may be good ways to, use this information. I don't know if anyone is, but a lot of this is information that's passed, to your operator. A lot of times you may have ordered your device from them, or hopefully you got it from, external. So they may have some insight into this already, but a lot of it is, not any person can walk off the street and set up a radio next to you and get all that information, but they can get the little snippets, and then the network operator themselves can get a lot more because they have the same keys that are distributed on your SIM, and therefore like you're more freely sending them that information. And I'll also note that not only does your operator see this, when you go through a roaming infrastructure, in many cases they can also see this type of traffic. And so if I'm a US citizen with a US carrier, and I go on a lovely family vacation to France, the French operator can see a lot of this information before it gets back to the US carrier. And so as you kind of travel, you're proliferating this information to other networks as well, depending on what protocol and what features set you're using.
Got it. And now, before I dive into a bit more about your guys' service here, can you maybe cover how well and also not well, and what issues are addressed and aren't addressed by maybe a pretty common workflow that our audience might have, which is maybe they have a phone, they're using the latest version, maybe some of them already use even lockdown mode, or they have things like disabling 2G and maybe even 3G. They might use a more modern cell carrier. They might have a system-wide VPN enabled, and maybe they use exclusively Signal and maybe a few other VoIP services. I would probably say that's a lot of our audience. So what are they protected against in that workflow, and what is still kind of up in the air?
Yeah. And so everything is like, death by 1,000 cuts. There's lots of little things to do. And there's not necessarily ever there's the one thing you could do that solves everything. Everyone focuses on kind of individual components. Like a VPN can hide from your ISP certain information, provide guarantees. And, when used in conjunction, they can be, a very powerful thing. So we'll start with a VPN. VPN, as a cellular provider, your cellular provider is also like your internet service provider. They're your ISP. And so under normal circumstances, they can see every IP address you're sending information to. They can see unencrypted traffic. A lot of times they can see DNS if left unencrypted. All of those are covered by something like VPN. Your voice and data records, those can be, like you said, covered by like an over-the-top app like Signal. You can turn off 2G and 3G, and that can prevent like what we end up calling close technical surveillance, or kind of like in-person, close to you types of attacks. Like it can help with, certain downgrade attacks to pull information off your device in 2G and 3G. But what really you sort of, even with lockdown mode, even with a VPN, if you've protected the data that's available at the application layer, the whole cellular side is still left wide open. And so, you even with lockdown mode, you're in 4G in a particular area, someone can still grab your IMSI, pretty easily, especially if they're, an advanced adversary. They could see you were in spot A and they could see you're at spot B. Or if they have access to the network, they could see, maybe where your home is and where the protest was, correlating different components that you didn't want, even if you were in lockdown mode the whole time. They can still see, if you own the actual radio towers. Again, when we talked about triangulation and those types of things, that data exists and can be there. If you think about like your phone will do, even if you're only using Signal, for example, most phones are what are called voice-centric devices, which means that if they're voice capable, they will always attempt to have a voice connection, even if it's not actually used. And so like you'll actually connect to your voice channel and you'll send a registration message. Even though you're not using it, you're not making a phone call, that information still flows might have like identifier information like your IMSI, like your user agent, and things like that. Even though you're not making a phone call, that still is there because you're registering. And so those pieces hide behind like what the phone was sort of designed to do, and less so all the things that use the data channels and the peripheral pieces that exist sort of within the phone, like Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, which are kind of a lot more understood. And a lot of the cellular pieces are sort of still deferred to other people to attempt to sort, or to, in most parts, leave alone, because global standards are difficult and move slow. And, in the end, people want a device that works and don't want to trade off functionality in many cases.
Got it. I feel like you did a really good summary there. So in that exact summary you just gave, you guys are trying to do something a bit different here. So in the past, and to this day, actually, like kind of our formal recommendations are like, hey, this is what you have control over on your phones, which is the things we just talked about. Like you can use Signal, you can use a VPN, you can enable lockdown mode, et cetera. Like these are all the things you have control over, but ultimately you can't do anything about your cell carrier. If you want cell connectivity, you kind of just have to deal with these problems. And the best maybe that you can do, which is what I've been doing, is I just use an MVNO, which allows me to register under like whatever information. It doesn't need a social security number. I can even use it with a different name. I get it shipped to a private mailbox. Like I do all the basic stuff there, and that's kind of what we've been recommending, but it's not dealing with any of those root issues. And so I was quite fascinated with you guys saying that you have your own kind of ways of doing things and your own infrastructure to get around these problems. And so I'll kind of leave it open to you to kind of start that thread, I suppose.
Yeah. And let me talk more generically. Like, what was our approach as a company? Our approach as a company was like, I guess if I sum it up, like positive control is sort of like the word, the phrase I end up using, which is how do we like try to get involved in as many of the places as possible? And many MVNOs are light MVNOs, or what they are they're like basically a sales platform on top of another carrier. And so they mostly facilitate connecting you, a paying customer, with cellular service on another person's network. And in many of those cases, you use their SIMs, you use their voice servers, you use their data nodes, all of that. And I think, for CAPE, what we ended up trying to do is like, how can we own more of that process and those components so that we can change them based off of what we think is important, and ideally what we hope is important to privacy and security conscious users around the country and the world. And without that degree, again, it's still just like if I only have one internet service provider and they're the only ones, and I slap a new sticker on it and say it's something different, it's really the same underlying thing. Maybe you get to do, I can, use a fake identity or a false identity, or, use a fake name. But in the end, all those components, it's all still the same underlying like software and hardware that's at play. And so we thought, okay, how do we change this so that it's our software at play? As an MVNO, focusing mostly on software, like how can we make sure that, the traffic is running through us rather than through something we know has these vulnerabilities. And therefore, we can now inject a different threat model. We can inject different technology, different thoughts, different processes to how we want to handle this. So the first step was like, I call it choosing hard mode, which is like, building the network out from underneath it. And that gives you options of what to do. And so, one option, to all MVNOs is how you want to do billing. And so that's, that's an easy one to like kind of cross off. Another thing we talked about with the CDRs, which is, even if you're, on another MVNO and you're still connecting to like the underlying carrier, they're the one generating the CDRs. They still see your IMSI, which is static. They can still see your IMEI because you're connected to the network. They can still see the phone number you're calling from. And they'll store it for however long the underlying carrier wants, probably years. You don't get to control that if you don't own the underlying like network components. And so, like for us, what does Cape get to do? We get to decide what's the retention period on CDRs. And our retention period is as short as we can possibly make it and still be able to like be a legally complying business that won't get driven out of business in a day. And so, we try to delete like as quickly as possible, always trying to figure out how do we shrink the time? Is there ways we can take the information when it's produced, anonymize it, and throw out the old copies? But we can choose to make, active decisions in what data is produced and take things, even the content of the CDRs. Like we actively try to remove identifiers that are unnecessary to even do billing remediation from what we're doing. And so like, I don't want to know the information. I hope our users don't want to know that information. And so minimizing it, as absolutely as possible, and then destroying it as soon as we can, it becomes something we can do by owning it, by owning the whole network. And then, moving towards pieces like take like your IMSI, for example, something that's typically static. You go and sign up for, a normal MVNO. They give you your SIM card or your eSIM. Your IMSI is not changing. It's static unless you like, ask for a new SIM card or download a new eSIM or you change carriers. But it is something that can be controlled if coordinated properly. And by owning our core and by owning the core network behind it, we can facilitate a user changing their identity over time without needing them to do much. An IMSI in the end is just a number. It's a 15-digit number that exists on your SIM card that identifies you. And as long as like we know what IMSIs can connect to the network and the key material behind them, we can set it to be whatever we want. And so someone with an IMSI grabber can sit there and collect your IMSI, but we can change it at any time we want and actively want to do that type of activity because it's an important part of our threat model for addressing a 4G deficit. And it can be complicated and it can maybe interfere a little bit with a user if they want to rotate their IMSI, you have to disconnect and reconnect. But having users who are bought into the value that's gained by it allows us to then implement that feature in our core network such that they can change that what's typically a static identifier. Now there's other parts of our network that kind of sit behind the scenes. When you had mentioned like SS7 before, there's a whole control signaling plane that exists in the global network. In 4G, it's under a protocol called diameter. But it all kind of comes down to like signaling traffic, which is how do I tell the network where I am? How do I tell them the feature set? How do I distribute the data? How do I do authentication? All of this happens on that plane. And we can actively develop signaling protection or rules or above and beyond like industry standard to prevent someone from saying that you're actually in another country when you're in the United States. And what we actively want to do is have our users participate in their own sort of defense, which are let them set thresholds for what they're willing to tolerate or not tolerate. Just how lockdown mode is an opt-in type feature that, even when you turn it on, it says like, hey, this is really not for most people. Have people have a say in the type of protection that they want and make some of those trade-offs for, maybe, ease of use versus security versus, something else. Like if I want to say, hey, I want to block all incoming like roaming requests from X number of countries or any country that's not like the country that I'm currently living in. That's something that we can do because we own the signaling plane, we own our network, and we own the features and functionality that we can then provide to our users to do. And so, that type of control is what becomes really like a key part in how we can implement protection at the cellular layer, ranging from just doing table stakes things well, along with an audience that understands. Because you take a really big carrier and they're going to be geared a lot more towards a common user, someone who needs connectivity, who wants a low price, who wants, all of these different things, as opposed to someone who wants to actively participate in choosing private and secure things, using features that maybe are a little bit more complicated, it all kind of depends. And with, sort of a bought-in audience on that feature of people who actively want to be able to set these things and control them, it gives us a lot more ground to roll out those types of features that can like address these things at a root level with the user kind of involved in that process. It's kind of like a high level how I end up thinking about how we provide protection, sort of above and beyond, normal over the top to address that cellular layer, which is, pretty difficult to get to without really getting down into the weeds and putting a lot of investment into standing up a network and interconnecting it with the rest of the global telco network.
Yeah, and that's kind of, I guess, maybe what's a bit misunderstood in general is like the mobile core aspect of things, because I think people are quite used to the MVNO and how they work. How and why? I mean, I know why actually, because you guys wanted more control, but I think, way back in the day, I just for fun kind of looked into like what it looks like to start an ISP or cell company. And it's overall seen as largely impossible to start like your own nowadays. So why would you, or how did you opt for this mobile core? Because it sounds like you actually have to own a lot more infrastructure than a typical company. And how are you still able to compete? Or do you not compete as well against maybe something like Verizon in some ways here?
Yeah. Why we chose to do this, well, again, I said like, positive control, but also like it's hard to build towards requirements if you can't do anything about it. And how do you challenge the status quo? And yeah, it's harder. It's harder to make agreements with, because again, even as an MVNO, we have to make agreements with other carriers because we don't have a radio network. We don't have tens of thousands of towers across large countries, and we don't have infrastructure around the world to support all of it. But what we do have are passionate people who want to like dig through these annoying problems, ranging from, you talk about setting up like an ISP, like even going and registering, getting our own ASNs, getting your own IP address space, cleaning the IP address space, because you can get IPs, but if you want people to be able to access websites, a lot of people block based on source IP. And so going after, each one of these, pieces presents an opportunity. And yeah, it makes it difficult to compete on the early stages because, in order to be, a cellular service that you can sell, like just kind of an expectation that you provide a bare bones set of features. And it can take a while to get to that, bare bones set of features. But it also, having a community built in of people who care about these problems also kind of creates a bit more tolerance around, explaining and providing transparency around the process, why it takes, time to build it, because you have to make good decisions each step of the way, knowing that like, phone companies have had like decades of head start on us is tough, but our goal is to be a comparable choice on like, the bare bones functionality. You can get all your data services, voice messaging, just like you would any other operator, but have significantly more play in your privacy and security. And so, it can be hard because again, we're also sometimes at the whim of, a Verizon, a T-Mo, and AT&T because they own all the cellular infrastructure and radio towers in the country, and a lot of that has been built out over many years. But going down this path, especially with a more niche community, is kind of an area that I don't want to say they're not necessarily interested in. It's harder for them to capture that we can invest in doing those types of things and get very passionate response back from the community about things we should or shouldn't do or build, which is what I guess the fun part of it, but also the challenging part. Because again, there's no like one problem, but a space of problems. And thinking forward to the future, I would hate to ever be known as like a one problem company. Maybe you can high level put it that way, but I want to be thought of as someone who can provide solutions to the space as it changes. And I think that's the other important part too, is, as we go to 5G to 6G forever, like always having this specific lens on the problem is, it kind of flows into, we're choosing to have a core, we're choosing to build components. And so we can, yes, like maybe we have some catching up to do, but we can then play in the game, going forward as the space changes as well.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a totally different approach, like a typical cellular provider. I think it's maximum data collection
Yeah.
versus you guys are minimum. So it's quite a different approach. So because of this infrastructure that you guys control, you're able to pretty much modify a lot of these different things that otherwise really can't be modified if anyone's using a cell carrier. So I think I read is it 24-hour for CDR deletion?
Yes.
And then is that configurable by the user, or is that just a staple that you set for all users?
Right now, it's just a staple we set for everyone. All records get purged.
Cool.
Sometimes there's some downsides, like maybe we need to do, if there's any processing and stuff we need to do, like if we miss our window, then we're out of luck. And, that's something that we have to absorb. And that was a conscious choice, which is like, we can absorb businessy things. It's hard to absorb like breaking privacy concerns. And so always moving towards the like, this is what we need to delete, and this is what wins when there's like a tie or a race, to it, is the decision we've made.
And then what about like IMSI rotation? Because you mentioned you guys will automatically rotate that. Is that on a set frequency, or is that like a user on-demand thing?
Right now, it's both. And so by default, it's once every 24 hours. But there's also an on-demand feature as well. So we know that people can't coordinate their schedules with what IMSI rotation time they set. And so knowing like, hey, if someone goes to a protest and wants to change their IMSI afterward, we need to be flexible to be able to accommodate them when they're in the event, before the event, after the event, and not limit them to like, I can only participate in events right as I'm in a border of an IMSI change or something like that. And so it's both.
Got it. And then when it comes to other user configurable things, is all of this mostly automatic? What's configurable for me as a customer in there?
Yeah. So, and I think the options you have are different based on the different types of offerings we have. We have our normal consumer service, and we also have a service called OBSCURA, which also has a device side component to it that is a bit more of the advanced, like very targeted mode kind of piece. But standard out of the box, there are the normal cellular service that you get. We provide our kind of standard signaling protection, so that's what something that everyone gets, ranging from, again, there are lots of industry standard type protections you get, plus you can kind of opt into sort of the advanced protection or being in the loop of like being notified when certain events happen, staying in the loop. IMSI rotation is a big one that we launched not too long ago. So being able to like easily toggle that on, you get change your IMSI once every 24 hours, or on demand as needed in the button with a button on there, along with lots of kind of default implicit choices that we kind of have that run on the background. A lot of which are network and device side coordination, things that are called like carrier bundles, which are kind of device configuration provided by your network. So kind of the implicit like good choices, along with different features that we have set. We recently also added in, I think we're calling it like last mile encryption, which takes certain SMS and sends it, instead of sending it over the telephony channel once it hits us, we send it via encrypted comms to your device instead. So just eliminating like another leg of potential compromise that happens. And so that can be potentially useful, especially if you're sitting in a roaming type scenario. Instead of distributing your traffic through someone else's infrastructure, we can deliver it directly to you. Because again, a lot of these SMS come over these insecure channels that can happen, and depending on the countries and the laws, certain things are forced to be unencrypted for lawful intercept purposes and compliance with regulatory. So I think those are a lot of the things that come kind of standard now in the app, and I think we're working on more features to roll out to, one, provide transparency around situations that you're in, so you can make a good decision about like, hey, am I more or less secure than I was before, along with more features on the signaling side. I guess I also didn't mention the multi-number features if you want to receive messaging on having kind of secondary and tertiary numbers as well to sign up for other features and functions and other services as well. So there's a lot of things you can choose from there.
I don't dislike it. It does the job, but I can't say I love my VoIP app that I use for like my second and third number. And I assume those would show up as like like if you're trying to register for an Amazon or Google account, I bet they would still register as like an actual real phone number. You guys don't use VoIP for that?
Those all come from our main, the same numbering pool that we have.
That's pretty cool.
And so,
okay.
Yeah, it's a big thing. And, I'll also mention like, I mentioned IP address reputation. Phone number reputation is like a huge uphill battle. I said we chose hard mode. Being a network operator and being like independent comes with a lot of challenges in like, how do you prove to people you're not malicious? How do you prove to people, these aren't spam numbers? And, a lot of times like the regulatory landscape of the country is a bit out of date. In order to get, phone numbers that belong to you, you need to own Spectrum. That's it's kind of a crazy thing to think about, is you have to go and buy Spectrum in different locations to get access to phone numbers from those locations. And then you have to worry about like, hey, if Meta doesn't like my phone numbers, they're going to block me from WhatsApp. And, everyone in the world uses WhatsApp, outside of the US. And, people want to be able to, communicate. Or again, things being flagged as VoIP numbers, even though they're not. And so it's this constant uphill battle of proving your reputation, fighting for your reputation, and then providing features that get to take advantage of the reputation that you have. It's tedious. It's the battle we chose. It's the battle I fight every day, and I love it. Like, it can be demoralizing sometimes, but, you get these breakthroughs that are just great. Little side note, it's just, always fun.
I bet. And it's a universal problem with all privacy tools. Simple Login, when I first used it, like we put out an interview when they just started. No one really knew who they were yet. And it blew my mind because there was really no such thing as an email aliasing service at that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
As far as I was concerned, like something that just forwarded, you can just generate emails and they all forward to one email inbox. And I was able to create a Facebook account for just to test with a Simple Login email, an Amazon account, I think even a Google account. And nowadays that sounds mind blowing. Because like there is no way in hell you can create like an account with those services. But that's kind of the same problem. Like these privacy tools do have an overall reputation. It's why VPNs get blocked when you try to log into your bank. It's why Tor browser gets blocked on different websites. And it's quite frustrating and it's an ongoing issue. So I'm not surprised that you guys have to deal with that too.
Yeah, there's no regulation around it. Like services do whatever they want. And so, they can say, hey, we don't think this is worth it. There's no one authority to go to. I mean, there's an authority that says these phone numbers are real, but that's usually only one data source that people are using to determine in their services. That, yes, this is a legal thing. Here's the paperwork for it. They're like, well, I'm still going to block it anyway. I saw spam from there. Sorry. Or, you have to work your way through mega corporations like hierarchy from like the support email address all the way to the top to see if you can figure out what happens. And it's frustrating for users who want to do the right thing and use the right services and then get basically punished for trying to do that. And so it's an uphill battle, but it's crazy how much I've learned going through all those and how arbitrary some of them are.
Yeah, it's frustrating. And I think, in my view, we don't really have any protections as end users in the US when it comes from a data perspective. But if there was something like a GDPR that was federal in the US, I think something that would be very modernized that even the GDPR didn't really encompass, as far as I'm aware, is like the right to register or access services with without needing to use the mainstream thing, right? Because right now, if you have a Gmail account, you can register for anything in the world for the most part. Like Gmail's never blocked, but sometimes using Proton gets blocked, and Proton is a legitimate service. Sometimes using Simple Login should be acceptable. And so I think it would be nice to have more protections for end users where you as a user can pick any service you want. And as long as that service is legally compliant, that should be okay. And I feel like, I don't know, there should be some kind of something there. And I'm sure you have better language around this than I do since you deal with it so often.
Yeah, I wish there was some authority I could go to just say like, hey, like we're real, like please make like X, Y, and Z play along with us. It would be great.
Yeah. Okay, now I do have just quick hit questions here. You mentioned OBSCURA. Not to be confused, I assume, with OBSCURA VPN, which is a totally different service. I interviewed them separately. Can you just briefly explain, like, what it looks like if someone goes for OBSCURA and how that differs from your typical offering?
Yeah. So OBSCURA is a much more, I'll call it like, the lockdown mode equivalent. It's, significantly more, advanced and tailors to a more advanced adversarial model. And it puts a lot more in control, for the user. It's like, how do I craft my persona? How do I change certain different identifiers? And the user's more involved in setting those configurations. There's a significantly more device side component. So it's not a BYOD. It's a like, here's a device. And again, it's something that's tailored more towards like highly targeted people. It's an advanced mode. Probably most people don't necessarily need it, and for some who do get it, it can be probably overkill for what they need, but provides a sense of personal security around it, which again is hard to quantify, but very important for people who are in stressful situations. So, but also from the technology side, it's a lot more control over those types of settings that you would have, like something like IMSI rotation, having more access to those types of things, which again, someone doesn't need to be tweaking it at a particular super high frequency given a normal threat model, but to some others it might be more tractable for them to have this advanced solution. But it's sort of a more encompassing device plus network combined solution rather than device light, because it's hard to write solutions that are prolific to all device types, so they can vary greatly, and the network bundle. So kind of like just a more advanced mode.
And then what device do you ship for that?
These are on the Nothing phone.
Oh, cool. Is there a reason? Is it because they're like affordable, or?
We work with them. I don't remember all the exact initial reasons, but yeah, they were a good device to work with.
And does it just run like the stock ROM, or do you guys customize it out of the box a little bit?
There's more device side customization on it that we've worked through. So it's a bit more tailored.
Got it. So registration, I believe you guys just generate a QR code, kind of like creating a Bitcoin wallet type of deal. Is that the whole account?
Yeah. And so each of the different offerings, like the web checkout to there. So yeah, then that basically is just facilitating like setup of your on device information. And so we use recovery phrase, very a la crypto wallet. Very hard to compromise and needed, just like you'd have your, big security, reset phrase for your password manager or whatever, having this phrase that's both, memorable and capturable that I think people in the community can hopefully understand, is a big aspect to it. And, that gates a lot of things like recovery or changing SIMs. Hence a lot of the SIM swap attack is like, it's not a person who goes in and does it. You have to provide a complicated thing, based in cryptography to kind of allow you to change certain aspects of your account.
Got it. And then did you guys opt for this from a privacy perspective? Because I assume that way doesn't require any emails, any names, et cetera. Or is this also like a SIM swap protection kind of thing, or both?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. We always, have to walk the line of like, we don't want to collect any information, but we also like sometimes need to, to get in contact with folks. We always have this debate back and forth, like, do we collect email? Do we not collect email? Like, ideally we don't collect it, but we might need to like send something to someone or facilitate. And so, part of this was like, how do we not have to do that? So like, if you're a recovery phrase, we don't need to like send you an email reset link or anything. You just go in and you can enter your phrase and recover that way. Part of like, the web checkout is, how do we like, can we walk the line of collecting less information as possible? Scan your QR code and go from there. So it's a little bit of both.
Can you pay with non-fiat? Like, what options do you guys have?
Right now it's all just credit card. For right now, I think we hope to be able to accept other currencies and stuff. It's something that constantly comes up, but not something we have right now.
Okay. And then just a broad question, someone might be hearing this, but, if you give someone something that they install on their device, like a VPN or Signal, it's more tangible that it's actually doing what it's promising to do. But this is a lot more behind the scenes. So theoretically, someone can just say, we're doing all these things, and there's no way for me as a user to verify that. So how can we even trust you guys that like you're doing what you're saying you're doing? Like, how do we know that you're deleting the call logs after 24 hours? Is there any kind of transparency there, or is it still a trust me system, which isn't any different than what you get from another cell carrier, I suppose?
Yeah. And when it comes down to, different components, there's kind of different answers. So, for example, we have an app, and the app can facilitate like, how do I prove that the second number is working? It's like, well, you're receiving information on the second number. It's a great way to do it. Same thing for some of our signaling protection, like basically providing information of like, yep, this is where we see a network attach coming in, giving you that information. You'd be like, yep, that's me. Like, I know I just connected to the network. So there are things that are like very easily we're able to like kind of share via our app of what's happening. And then there are like things like CDRs are, it's a bit harder. How do I prove that we're not collecting, that information? Parts of that are like, we can share out our policies, share out a copy of like, what does a CDR look like? What are we collecting? What are we not? In the end, there's a bit of trust that has to happen there. I was gonna say, ideally, like someone can like prove that that doesn't happen. We have to figure, if there's a great way to figure it out, we're always trying to figure out how do we prove to our people what we're doing. The hope would be, one day, it's sort of the blessing and the curse if like, we're compromised, maybe all companies are, that there's nothing that comes of it. Like people don't have this information stolen. Like that's case in point is like, in a zero trust model, like you get compromised and like they can't do anything with it. We say, hey, we were compromised, but like no one sees anything. Blessing and a curse because you have to be compromised for that to happen. And then trying to do things like, publish blog posts, publish pieces about the technology that we're doing, try to like, let people see the methodology by which we're doing things and provide them with a, hey, look, we've thought about this type of problem, these types of solutions, this is how we came up with it. Like you can try to be a little bit more assured that, we're surrounding the problem in the right way and make a more informed decision about it. But we're also always on the lookout of, how do we prove to people what they're interested in? And is there things that we can provide that make that happen is kind of an area we're always looking to expand in.
Got it. And then what's your compatibility between devices?
So, I mean, right now, we support both Android and iOS. There's some caveats to them just because of how difficult the OEM ecosystem is. And we're a small company, so we haven't, tested on everything. And there's a lot of things from OEMs that are very locked down to people who don't have large scale agreements with that we're working on whittling those away. But for the most part, Normal Services works on iOS and most mainstream Android devices. We try to work with Graphene to make sure Graphene works. We know a large percentage of the community likes Graphene, is participating in that community, and so we want to be part of that as well. So we try to make sure Graphene support works and is functional, and as we uncover things that are different between stock ROMs, we work to address those as well. And then we have some other limitations, like we made a decision to support provide eSIMs. So like if you're in a non-eSIM capable device, which again I think most newer devices in the last probably good number of years support eSIM, and so there's certain like device type restrictions based on technology like that. And like I said, working through some of the kinks with the different ROMs that are published by different OEMs and the different features and how they interact with our network. It's a very tailored process, even in Android and in iOS, and how you push configuration out to them that control the telephony side. It's actually also super fascinating. I didn't know any of this existed before I dug in at Cape. A good amount of that is actually in the Android source code if you ever want to poke around these different carrier configuration settings. And there's some folks who published the carrier bundles pulled, I think, via iTunes at one point on iOS, somewhere on GitHub as well, if you ever want to look what different carriers are setting behind the scenes.
Fascinating. And are you guys US only, or are you international as well?
Right now, I think we're US only. That doesn't mean we don't support international roaming, but our network is geared towards like US regulatory perspectives and selling towards US customers, with the hope that we can expand that to be global.
And if someone roams, like if I'm a US customer, I use Cape, and then I go visit Germany for a conference, will I still get the Cape protections even though I'm in Germany, or is it just kind of going to fall back to a regular cell carrier at that point?
Yeah, you'll get some of Cape's protections depending on where you are and the infrastructure you're in. So things like IMSI rotation will still function. There's a slightly different threat model, as in like now instead of your data flowing more directly through us, it's flowing through these international roaming channels. So there's maybe some different purview, but a lot of the main features will still continue to function. It all comes back home, eventually touches our network in some capacity.
Got it. And then how do you guys handle law enforcement requests if those come up?
We have to follow all of the regulatory compliance of any U.S. operator. That means we participate in CALIA and legal wiretaps if given to us. We have to comply by those. Based on how people send our requests, like we have not had problems, at least on the lawyer side, of making sure like with things like IMSI rotation, like if we're given requests against IMSIs, there's only so much we can guarantee by definition. Things that we can't encrypt, we don't have to try to decrypt, which means like, hey, if signal data traffic, comes through our network, like we're under no obligation to decrypt it. I think the law is, and lawyers can check me if I'm right, is like you can't be compelled if you don't own any of the keys. So, again, we'll have to comply for lawfully provided warrants. And then I think there's other parts where we'll do what we can to inform people if there's no gag orders on those types of enforcements. Like those are things that we can attempt to do, is like let people know if there are wiretaps, if we're legally allowed to do so. So we try to do the best within the legal system while still being compliant.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are still a company. I think that's one of the most misunderstood things, is like you can just be a company and take money from people and then just ignore all the laws and somehow still exist. And
exactly. We don't want to encourage criminal activity or anything like that. But, privacy and security is always a double-edged sword. And so we'll have to walk that line carefully and, again, follow all the legal requirements that we need to.
Yeah. And I feel like, I don't know how true this is. I don't know if you guys have insight into this, but what you're describing, I mean, based on what I see, it seems like law enforcement and typical cell carriers, it's a very loosey-goosey relationship, and it seems like it's quite easy for that to happen, where even what I'm hearing from you sounds like if cell carriers even did a little bit more of that pushback, that would still be a big win for maybe some overall rights for individuals. Because I don't know if they always get a warrant when they tap on these cell carriers, because I've seen lots of stories where they didn't get a warrant, so I have to assume there is some way that they can get that.
Yeah. I don't have a lot of experience, but if it's anything like the TV shows, it seems like they manipulate their way in. But I think our goal is to always challenge everything, make sure everything is in order, and then comply to those that are following the law.
Yeah, and then something I'm sure you guys have seen, and I think it definitely made my ears perk up as well. I don't know the exact relationship, but I think some of you guys used to work at Palantir, and I know that's a very controversial company, and so I don't know if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, and I'm one of those. I'm one of those people. I worked at Palantir for 8.5 years, in the government space, and as a software engineer. And like many of us, we became acutely aware of these types of problems, while working there. And, we had access to different challenging data problems, and it really kind of like an eye-opening experience to what was happening in the world and the types of problems that exist. And so, if there's any takeaway, I think everyone's going to have their own sort of personal feelings about companies in general. But I think my biggest takeaway from Palantir was curiosity and like commitment, and that like I'm, like for me and like for many of us, it's like understanding a problem that exists, understanding the scope can be large, and understanding there's lots of ways to approach the problem. Sometimes those are short term, sometimes they're medium term, sometimes they're long term, and really like, I don't know, choosing that hard mode type problem that is worth it, and not letting that shy away. And so at the very least, letting people know that despite what they may think about different companies, like those are sort of the philosophies that us that came from those types of companies have brought forward to Kate.
Yeah, I think there's the two ways of looking at it, because there are other privacy projects in the space that were started from people who almost worked for the opposite, like the thing they're trying to protect against now. So the two ways of looking at it is like, oh, they can't be trustworthy whatsoever. Or the other perspective is like, oh, they saw how the food is made, and they're like, oh, I don't want to do that anymore. So I suppose it's everyone's feelings towards that. For me, it kind of depends on the company. Like when I actually get to meet the people behind it, like I feel like for me, it's a little bit more telling as to like maybe the intentions behind it. I'm down to the last few questions, I promise here. They have to be right here for them. If you guys can hear the air blurs. You guys partnered with Proton. What does that look like? What does a partnership with Proton look like? And how did that come about?
Yeah. And so I think it's always sort of our philosophy that there are many different pieces of the puzzle that have to come together to actually form a privacy picture or security picture, whatever you want to say. And I think there's an acknowledgement, at least on our part, that like not everyone has to do every single thing. We can provide some insight into what the cellular side's doing. We can provide protections that are in there. but still there's, an untapped part. Like these tools aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, they're designed to be used together. And I think a big part of, what the partnership means to me is the acknowledgement of that fact. The acknowledgement of, one, it's kind of hard to say like, I'm going to put all my eggs in one basket. And it's like, I think part of it's saying, hey, you can spread your eggs out in multiple baskets. That's okay. People are doing different things. They're going to specialize in different pieces. And I think, a great way to do that is showing up, a partnership with Proton, who provides, a complementary service, to what we're doing, to a community of people who are going to, I think, understand the value of both of them.
So is the partnership more of just like a publicity, like you guys are partners, or is there some like, do you get like a Proton discount if you join Cape? Does it come with a subscription, vice versa?
Yeah, I don't know if the promotion's still running, but it was when you signed up for for Cape, you'd get N months of Proton for free. Trying to like again get into the community, help people build a good set of tools at their disposal, and select products that are complementary.
Got it. And then who would you just overall say Cape is for? You brought up a lot of concerns today, and we talked a lot about the technical side of things. And I think it's natural for our audience to say, okay, like I get it. I get who it's for. But if someone's just using Verizon, they don't think about this stuff. Like, why should they even care about this? And is Cape even for that person? Or would you still argue there's a place for it there?
Yeah. In my dream, Cape's for everyone. And I think my goal has always been to sort of try to meet people where they're at. And different people are going to have different insights into different systems and features and functions, and have different value systems. And when it comes to privacy and security, I've always wanted to, and this is my dream going into Cape, is help raise the bar for everyone, but also give people the opportunity to like lift it themselves in addition to that. And so my hope is that Cape is for everyone. And I want it to be approachable for everyone. It doesn't mean everyone will select it and may have their other criteria, but I don't want it to be something that people are afraid to choose because it's so complicated. But I want people who really understand, the space to really be able to get a lot of value out of it. And so a lot of it's, meeting people where they are, understanding their use cases, automating or doing things, in an automated fashion for people who don't understand it but know they have concerns about it, but also letting those folks who want to, get in hard mode, enabling them to kind of control their own fate there as well.
Got it. And then the last question I have for you is just, what's the most shocking thing that you've seen anywhere that you think would maybe blow someone's mind? Yeah, I think people hear about these things like cell tower triangulation, even old forensic files would introduce the concept. But what's something that's just so crazy that if you told most people, they might not even believe you?
I mean, there's definitely a few things. I think the thing I didn't realize, so much. I mean, basically, the telecom is like a whole private internet. I think people may kind of figure that out, but may not realize it, and that these networks all interconnect through all these private exchanges and do all these different types of things. And not always encryption is necessary or encouraged, but all these things kind of happen in a way that's not necessarily accessible to most folks. Your data travels through all kinds of interesting paths. And it's way more sort of complicated behind the scenes. It's not just carrier A sending traffic over the internet to carrier B. They have these private fiber connections that does X, Y, and Z, and they go into this hub, which connects to these 100 other carriers that does, that do all these things. That there are all these companies and stuff that sit in the middle that facilitate it. That it's way more, I mean, I guess the internet is complicated, but it's like a whole do-over of that. That I kind of found baffling. I think in my heart of hearts, I always knew that. But how you untangle that to connect to other people, and how these these carriers work, and then knowing that kind of how well the world of cellular works is sort of baffling. You're like, and maybe you open every system, and you're like, oh, it's all duct tape and bubble gum, and you open it up, you're like, hey, this is kind of duct tape and bubble gum, but it kind of works. Is amazing that it happens. That to me was the most surprising thing. Is I don't know how else to put it. It's hard to put into words, but
It's hard to make it tangible.
Yeah, you peek underneath and you're like, I cannot believe this thing functions. And then you close it and maybe it's it looks like a well-oiled machine, but it's all kind of crazy behind the scenes, which is kind of ripe for injecting ourselves and solving some tough problems.
Nice. Well, thank you so much, David, for your time. I know this is a super vague industry. It's been really hard for me to do coverage for this behind the scenes. Like the research on it is quite limited, especially from a privacy perspective. And so I do feel like it's a pretty limited expertise that you guys probably have right now. And so having you on this interview and being able to ask these direct questions was very helpful for not just me, because I learned a lot from this, but also our audience, I'm sure. So just thank you for your time. I know I kept you much longer than we anticipated.
Yeah, no problems. I'm glad I can provide this. I think if there's one thing I've learned, one, like I had to acquire all this information. I didn't come from a traditional telco background, and it was hard to get this information. And sort of the transparency around it is one of the things like I'm very passionate about. And so, letting people peek behind the curtain, every now and then is a treat.
Awesome. Well, thank you, David.
Thank you so much.
And there we have it. I really hope that you all learned as much from this as I did. There were a lot of new things that I hadn't heard before, a lot of nuance that I just feel like needed to be discussed when it came to cellular-based privacy. It's a very, very tricky thing, and it's been hard to offer that many pieces of advice because it feels like there's not that much control. So I'm really happy that there are teams like CAPE that are coming forward and trying to do something about it. And we are starting to see other services step up and try to offer more privacy on the cellular level. So I really hope that this is a trend that we begin to see move in the right direction, because up until now, it's been pretty horrific. I really want to thank CAPE for their service and also taking the time to explain all of these concepts in an interview. And we will have an upcoming video soon that is also partnered with CAPE, where we actually pretty much take all of this and make it a very consolidated, typical guide that you would find on Techlore. So it's very actionable advice for all of you out there. So we'll see you in that video. And thank you for watching this Techlore Talks interview.